Hey, welcome back. This is part 2 of the face drawing series using the Reilly method. If you haven't watched part 1 yet, go back and check that one out first because this one picks up right where that one left off. In part 1, we built the structure using the Reilly Abstraction with the rhythms and the proportions, and that one was about getting everything in the right place. This video is about what comes next, taking that scaffolding and developing it into something that actually looks like a face. We're going to lay in the large shapes, build volume, and then start pushing in with the details that make the portrait feel real. So let's get into it. Also, this video is sponsored by Squarespace, but I'll tell you more about them later. So once we've got our scaffolding from the Reilly method, the next question is, how do we actually develop this into a drawing? And the answer is large shapes first. Always. I'll sometimes start with a pencil just to loosely scribble in the shadow shapes, not being precious about it, just trying to capture the big masses of shadow accurately. I'm definitely not worrying about details, but I am worrying a little bit about the edges. I want to get these shapes down, but they do need to be a bit accurate. Then I'll switch to a brush. I'm alternating between a few different sizes throughout this, but mostly between the medium and the large. And I'm using graphite powder on the brush to blend those shapes in and cover large areas quickly and gently. The reason I prefer brushes over pencils for this stage is simple, but also really important. They're much easier to erase from, and they let you cover a lot of ground very lightly. You're not committing to anything, you're just building up a soft layer of tone that you can easily lift out of, you can darken it, and it's a bit easier to adjust it as you go along. Now, there's a couple areas I want to flag as particularly important at this stage. The first one being the eye socket and the eyelid. The eye socket helps inform some of how big the eyelid might be and some of the flesh below the eyelid. And creating these eyelids is kind of what separates drawings from looking a little bit amateurish or having the eyes just floating on a flat face to integrating the eye into the skull and into the cheekbones in a really meaningful way that makes it or gives it that very realistic look. I don't quite know how to articulate this properly, but it's really one of the very first important principles that the Reilly method helps us to do. So I'm filling in the shadow shapes, lips underneath the chin, around the nose, around the eye, still sticking to large shapes, not diving into any details yet. And throughout this all, the Reilly method is still playing its part in the background. Those lines and rhythms I laid down in part 1, they're telling me where my cheekbone shadow should sit, where the shadow between the brow and the eyelid should fall, where the shadow underneath the nose belongs, and the structure is still guiding everything, even as I start to develop tone over it. Before I go further into the face, I'm going to lay down the background and get the rough shape of the hair in. When you're working on a portrait, your tones don't exist in isolation. They only make sense relative to each other. So if I want to know how dark my face shadow should be, I need a reference point by getting that deep, dark background in. Now I've established my darkest dark, I know what the full tonal range I'm working with should be, and now I can calibrate the face tones against that. I'm not being afraid to go very dark here. That contrast point is what's going to tell me everything I need to know about how dark to push the tones in the face. I'm also taking that excess graphite and brushing it lightly over the shadow side of the face, just creating a base tone that I can pull highlights out of later with an eraser. Because I'm pressing so lightly, I know I'll always be able to recover those highlights very easily. Then I'll do a little bit of shape in the neck, and this is just enough to anchor the head and give me some tone to work against. It also just helps the head not look like it's floating in a white or dark void. Now I'm coming back into the eyes and starting to develop them a bit more. I'm enhancing the shadow below the brow, really getting that depth in, and quite an important point that makes a massive difference is protecting the highlight in the eye. I'm leaving a tiny glint of light untouched, just a small area that I know I want to eventually be pure white. I'm being careful to not cover it And the reason is that once it's gone, it's much harder to get it back cleanly. So I want to protect it early, and then later I can pull it back to white with an eraser. That little highlight is what gives the eye life. It creates the impression of moisture, of light hitting a wet surface. It's one of those tiny details that has a disproportionate effect on how alive a whole drawing feels. I'm still leaving the eyelids a little bit untouched at this stage. I want to work on those carefully a bit later. Something I want to mention here, because I use it a lot throughout, is this, the eraser. It isn't just for fixing mistakes, it's a drawing tool. You can almost use it to sketch as well. Because I've been laying down graphite with brushes very lightly, the surface is always recoverable. That means I can use a precision eraser to actually draw with, pulling out highlights, refining edges, cleaning up shapes. It's incredibly useful. The lower lid is a surface that faces slightly upwards, so it catches light. When you pull that highlight out, the eyelid suddenly looks wet and slightly reflective, like a real eyelid. It gives the eye an enormous amount of life. Then I'm enhancing the shadow underneath the top eyelid, right where the upper eyelid meets the eyeball. The lid has thickness, and that thickness casts a shadow down onto the iris. It's a subtle, dark edge, but it gives the eye an incredible amount of depth and dimension. I'm going back into the cheeks, around the mouth, around the chin, slowly building up the tone, getting closer and closer to the contrast I want. And I want to make a point here about patience, because it's tempting to try and get everything in one pass, but working slowly and layering, building on what you've just done, always reassessing and asking if things are in the right place and making micro adjustments to slowly massage them into the right place just helps you get extremely accurate with your drawing over time. This way you have so much control, you can always course correct at any point. Nothing is irreversible. If something feels too dark, you can erase some of it very gently. If a shadow isn't reading, you can deepen it. Keep moving around the drawing, keep comparing shapes and tones to each other. Then moving on to the eyelashes, there's another little trick here. These hairs will often have a little highlight on the end of them, and also again because we've drawn in so lightly with a brush, and because we have that little shadow underneath the eye, we can use an eraser to carefully create that highlight at the end of the eyelash. Now I'm starting to get some detail into the nose, drawing in some small little highlights to give it a slightly shiny quality and to describe its form, and then getting into some tiny pores on the surface texture as well. This is where a principle comes in that applies to everything from pores to moles to the texture of skin. If something protrudes, the highlight goes on the side facing the light, and the shadow falls on the opposite side. If something is indented, it flips. The shadow goes on the side of the light source, and the highlight goes on the opposite side. So a tiny pore, which is an indentation, will have its little shadow on the light side, and its tiny highlight on the shadow side. If that makes sense, it's kind of flipped around. That's what makes your brain read it as going in rather than coming out. These are tiny, subtle marks, and after I've put them in, I'll brush lightly over them to soften everything, so it doesn't look too harsh or too rendered. The textures should more be felt than seen as these very stark, visible things. It's a subtle thing, but you do get used to it. Eyebrows are often drawn as flat, solid shapes, or even if the hairs are rendered, they're just rendered as these dark lines. But a nice little trick is to remember that these little hairs often catch light, so either in the middle of the hair itself or at the end of the hair, there might be a little highlight. Also, the top part of the eyebrow often has a lot of highlighted little hairs. So I'm going in with an eraser and just creating some texture and some reflective light in some of these tiny little eyebrow hairs. And it makes a big difference in making this feel like it's realistic hair rather than just drawn, rendered lines. I'm drawing in the little line of water that sits between the eyeball and the bottom eyelid, the water line. This is another one of those small details that has a big effect. It makes the eye look moist and alive, and I'm using the precision eraser for this, just pulling out a fine, bright line. Because of the way we apply the graphite so gently with brushes, it allows us to pull tiny little lines with an eraser out very carefully, like this. There's a balance to be struck here. We put the marks in softly, and then if they're still too much, we can brush over them with a soft medium brush, and then gently erase or draw them back in and brush over them until we start to feel like it's very subtly suggested rather than these harsh features. And now I'm just doing the final pass. I'm moving around the whole drawing. I'm refining the irises, doing tone correction, getting shapes more accurate, going back to the eyebrows, finishing details on the cheeks, making sure everything is sitting where I want it. At this stage, I'm not really adding anything new. I'm just looking, asking myself, does this feel right? Where is my eye being pulled? Is there anything that's working against the drawing? And that's where I want to leave you, with the idea of looking, because the longer you draw, the more you realize that the skill is in the observation. You can have great technique and still produce something a little bit flat if you're not really seeing what's in front of you. You can also produce something that feels alive with a very modest technique if you're genuinely looking. Before I end this video, I just want to give a quick shout out to this video sponsor, Squarespace. I've been working with them for a couple of years now, and they've played a huge role in my career, not only in sponsoring these videos and helping me maintain this channel, but early on in my career, I was looking for a way to showcase my work and make it easy for collectors to find me and get in touch with me. And I felt that Squarespace did all of that effortlessly. I never had to patch or upgrade anything. I could register a domain with them and set up an online store. And most importantly, I could design a portfolio and show my work the way that I wanted to. Also, every time I got stuck, their amazing support team helped me out instantly. So if you're looking at building a website, give Squarespace a try. And if you decide that you love them, use this offer code and get 10% off your first purchase. There we go. I hope that this was a helpful draw along. It was a lot of fun to use the Reilly method and to get a fully rendered portrait. I'm really happy with how it's come out, and I hope that there's some tips and tricks in here that are useful for you as well. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions. I'd be happy to answer as many of those as I can. And if you found this helpful, leave a like. It helps the channel out in a huge way. As always, thanks for the support, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.